أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي على رسوله الكريم أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. So since we began this, what I hope to be a blessed gathering, inshallah ta'ala, because we are talking about pious people of the past and we are also talking about their works as a form of inspiration. But when we look at history or when we look at historical figures, we don't merely replicate them. We can't replicate people of the past. We can't replicate movements of the past. But we look at the past for a number of reasons. One of them is to make the world a better place, to use the past to think about the present and to imagine a better future for us and for our children. We learn from their lessons, we learn from their bravery, from their, dare I say, from their mistakes even. So it's a good way of learning about the world. But also when you read books about history, and I'm always encouraging my friends to read history, among other things, because history opens your mind to different vistas, different worldviews of how the world was very different. I often romanticize how different our world is, radically different and shifting at a phenomenal pace compared to how our elders would have perceived the world. I'm reading about AI at the moment, artificial intelligence, and how that's learning at a phenomenal pace and how it's developing at a phenomenal pace. Now we read about how we don't even need armies anymore, soldiers anymore. We can use drones which are powered by artificial intelligence, which can meet targets thousands and thousands of miles away. They can kill people. And what does that mean for ethics and morality? In the 1960s, we had a Cold War. Two superpowers were literally about to drop nuclear weapons on each other, kill millions of people. And that was at the last minute, averted. But now we have this new technology which is so much more powerful, so much more harmful. So we're living in a world which is fractious, changing at a phenomenal rate. When we were not so young, the internet was just bursting onto the scenes. Mobile phones were coming out. We had those old snakes. You could play on it, those phones. And now the world has changed phenomenally at a fast pace. If you go back to your granddad's world, your great-grandfather's world, things didn't change much. Things were pretty much the same. So the world is shifting at a phenomenal rate. And to have conversation with our youth today who are dealing with all of that and dealing with all these anxieties, and we're seeing that the world is changing at a rate that we cannot even fathom. God knows, only Allah knows where we will be in 10 years' time. Now they can take images of you, if you have an image of yourself, and they can make a video of you just by taking an image of you. And they can create fake movies of you. So that creates questions around witness in a court. Can it be used as evidence in a court if you don't know if it's a real video, if it's a real picture, if it's generated by AI? Right? You can actually do that now. So an image of you which is available on the internet somewhere. The technology is so powerful that it can create any movie it wants, right, from you, out of you. We've heard about khutbahs that has been produced through AI technology. So this is a scary world that we're living in, and the world that's moving at a very fast pace. And the legislators, the people who make laws, are not going to be able to catch up with all of this, because as you know, laws take a long time to come into force because it goes through a long process. So this is how fast the world is moving. But we look at the past and it's interesting to see how their world was very stable. And sometimes that was a better world. The better world that our grandparents had, which was stable. They might not have technology and they might have not had the internet. And they didn't really know what was going on the other side of the planet. Now you meet people and they say to you, Maulana, every day I have anxiety. I say, Q, but Maulana, I watch the news and I hear all negativity. I hear about this war, I hear about this disease, I hear about global warming, this, and it just makes me really depressed. So I said to him, but there's an easy solution, just switch off. I said, you don't have to know about it all. Our grandparents, great-grandparents didn't know about all of this, and they still happily lived their lives. They knew what was happening in the village. In the village, they knew what was happening, that was it. But we live in a world where we are being intensely fed with ideas, news, that in some ways doesn't really matter. It doesn't really shape or change our behavior the next day. Right? It doesn't really change us in any fundamental way. That doesn't mean, obviously, that we don't be aware of current affairs. We should be aware of what's happening in the world. The Prophet ﷺ was well aware, well acquainted with what's happening around him. but we're a little bit more suspicious, we're a bit more judicious with the agenda on what's going on and so forth. So history is very, very useful. And of course, the Quran is not a historical book, but it gives you stories from the past. Not because it's historical and it's fun to read, it's because you can learn lessons from them. You can learn about the errors that Pharaoh perhaps made. You can learn about the good choices that Yusuf ﷺ made, the intelligence of Ibrahim ﷺ, the rational faculties that he used. You can learn about Musa ﷺ and his journey and his own challenges that he had within himself. You can identify yourself in the Quran. But the Quran is obviously a book of hidayah, first and foremost. It's not a book of history. You don't read it for history. You read it for guidance, to find yourself in the Quran. Because the Quran is like a mirror. You hold the Quran and it's telling you a lot about yourself. You'll find yourself in the Quran. The Quran is a very powerful book. It's a majestic book. It's a very poetic book. It's a deep book. The more you read it, the more you peel away at the Quran, the deeper the meanings become. So that's the Quran for you. Somebody asked me a question just a week ago, a professor. He said, Maulana, AI is becoming so smart, will it start challenging the Quran? I said, inshallah, that won't happen. Because of the way the technology is improving. I said, no, inshallah, Allah Ta'ala will protect the Quran because that's for us. Allah said the Quran will be preserved and protected. So Allah protect and preserve our iman, our children, in the days to come and the years to come, inshallah Ta'ala. But we have something that's unique, which is our religion, Islam, the faith that we have, which is not really changing at its core. At its core, we will still believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the one divine being. At its core, we follow the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. At its core, we follow the Quran. We perform our salah. No amount of technology will ever replace that. No amount of technology will never replace the fact of Hajj and the spiritual meaning and the significance it has for us when we go for Hajj. So our religion, inshallah, has undergone many challenges and it has remained until this day. Colonialism, which I'm going to talk about today, was one of them. When the Europeans came to our lands and took our lands, took many of our assets, took our religion, our identity, our culture. A lot of that came, but we are still here in the 21st century, 5% of the population in modern Britain. Unprecedented in human history that Muslims, traditionally the ulama would say you're not allowed to leave Muslim lands. Right? The only reason you can leave a Muslim land is for business. Sahih? Only for business. You would leave only for business and you'd come back to the Muslim lands. Now in the last couple of decades, our elders, they migrated to these lands. Right, and they've decided to settle in these lands, which is like a new phenomenon. This has never happened in Islamic history, in European history. Europeans used to hear about us. They used to hear about the Turks. They used to hear stories about us, and they would meet maybe one or two Muslims at the ports. In places they would come from Yemen, in places like Cardiff and these sort of places, or Liverpool. But they wouldn't really meet Muslims on a day-to-day basis. They wouldn't hear much about Islam. And the only thing they would hear about Islam was second-hand information. They wouldn't really be interested in us. But now we're present, we're here in these lands. So that's something to be excited about, that we're here as a significant minority living in Britain, but also in the West in particular. So in this short talk today, I want to focus just a little bit and just introduce something that's very, very close to my heart and something that causes a lot of confusion, which is this idea of Sharia and Tariqah. Sharia, the word we're familiar with, and Tariqah, which is the path. And I want to look at it through the lens of our elders. When I mean our elders, what I mean by that is the Deobandi elders, because that's the one I'm most familiar with, and that is the one that most of us have grown up in. Even if we don't know much about the history, it's worth knowing a little bit about them. Of course, they came from South Asia. The movement stemmed from South Asia, and they flourished at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And at least in many of the scholars that I've read, they combine two important aspects, which is something worth noting, which is that they achieve high spiritual achievement. They were spiritual people. They were part of the Sufi tariqah, but they were also people who were scholarly. They wrote great books. I mentioned one of them just last week about Maulana Muhammad Zakaria rahmatullahi alayhi, and his Awjazul Masalik and his other books. So they were spiritual people, deeply spiritual people, enriched people, but they were also scholarly people. So they combined both virtues and both excellences. And they also learned this from their forefathers. And two particular scholars, which we won't have time to go into today, which is worth noting, is Allama Sirhindi, Ahmad Sirhindi rahmatullahi alayhi. He died in 1624. And Shah Waliullah Dehlawi, who died in 1762. They were intellectually their forefathers. They were the people that they got their ideas from, and we will talk about them as well. So I want to just introduce a little bit about them for your own benefit and offer some reflections, if I may, on this topic as well. Bi-Iznillahi ta'ala. So let's begin. Now, the relationship between Sharia, Islamic law, I don't like using the word Islamic law, but that's an academic discussion. So we won't go into that. We'll park that bus. That's an academic discussion. I have a big problem with people calling the Sharia Islamic law, but people will just use that word because it's one of a better phrase. Because for me, the Sharia is very much more deep than that, and something I'm writing about as well. But Sharia and Tasawwuf is the spiritual side of Islam, have been very, very important parts of Islam. In a modern era, especially because of the influence of Western modes of thinking, people emphasize one over the other. They sometimes paint it as a contention. They're both like loggerheads. They're both fighting with each other. That's often how it's presented. In our modern age, for example, in the last few decades, even in Britain, even our own people have downplayed tasawwuf. They've downplayed spirituality because of various reasons. I'm not going to go into all of them, but one of them was because of petrodollars, Saudi petrodollars, and there was this enforcement that you guys are not following the Quran and Sunnah, and this spirituality is all nonsense and it's not part of Islam. Nothing could be further from the truth. Spirituality, tasawwuf, has been in part of our religion from the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and there are verses that point towards this as well. And nearly every alim, every shaykh that you can think of who's worth his weight has been part of a tariqah. Even the ones who wrote huge books on many, many topics, they were part of a tariqah, they were part of a Sufi brotherhood, if you like, as well. And so this idea at the forefront we need to deal with, which is that this is not true. This is simply not true. And even when they use Sufism to say, well, these Sufis are people who just sit in the corner of a room and they pray tasbih and they don't get involved in the world. That's not entirely true as well. So you have both extremes as well. And in one of my YouTube videos, I actually gave examples of Sufi ulama who are at the forefront of the struggles against colonialism. They were doing zikr all day, but they were also making fikr for the ummah at the same time as well. So there's been lots of debates and divisions over this as well. And some people say this whole Sufism thing is an innovation. I remember when I went to university, after I graduated from Darul Uloom, and this was one of the first things that came to me, like, oh, you're a Sufi. Yeah, you're from that tradition, they're all Sufis. And I was like, we've been studying Quran and Hadith all 7-8 years. Well, I remember when I was in Mecca many, many years ago, just freshly graduated, and I had a book of Imam Ghazali in my arm, in my hand like this. I was in Mecca, and somebody stopped me and says, oh, he's a deviant. He pointed at Imam Ghazali and said, he's a deviant. You know, you can't be reading this stuff. He uses weak hadith and he's like this. And I've been like benefiting from his works. He opened my mind, he opened my heart. So there has been things like this. I've done a lecture in places where I argue against this. Imam Ghazali is very, very important for us, extremely important. And our elders in the Deobandi tradition and many other traditions have a lot of respect and reverence for Imam Ghazali. I think people don't understand the stature and the amount of work Imam Ghazali has done, his books and his works as well. So it's very, very important to reflect upon this. What is the Sharia? Sharia, we use the Urdu word usually when we're using our language. We say Shariat. That's what we say, Shariat. And the Arabic word is Sharia. And they have the same meaning. They literally have the same meaning. They have a number of meanings, but one of them is the word Shara'a or Sharia means you go to a watering place where you go to drink water from, for men and for animals. So it's a way to water. Sharia is a way to water. It's a way to get. So in the traditions of the Arab culture, they will go down a little valley and they will go and drink water from there. So that's what a Sharia literally means. Shara'a means, in a technical sense, it refers to the laws that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordained for us and for his followers, and that was conveyed to humanity through his prophets. All his prophets that conveyed the message that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala presented them with to humanity as well. It also has a deeper meaning. The way you connect it is that it means it's a way to the eternal life. Because remember the water. What is the water? Water is a life-giving force. Pani, water, ma, is a life-giving force. So the Sharia, when you drink from the Sharia, it gives you life. What kind of life does it give you? Eternal life. There's so many resonances with this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran talks about rivers that will be flowing beneath our feet in Jannah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about, Rasul talks about how on the Day of Judgment we will all be drinking from the Kawthar. right? That's mentioned in the Quran, the Kawthar as well, abundance. So water has a lot of meaning. So the water is a pure, pristine creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we are thinking about going to other planets, what's the first thing we look for? Water. Because we know without water we can't sustain ourselves. So water has a lot of meanings. وَكَانَ عَرْشُهُ عَلَى الْمَاءِ. Allah says that His arsh is situated upon the water. Allah knows best what it means. But the idea is water has a huge amount of significance in the Islamic tradition as well. The Sufis would say, the ulama, the mashayikh would say that, Islam is like water. Islam pani ki tarah hai. That wherever Islam goes in the world, it doesn't destroy that culture, that civilization. What it does is it enriches that culture, civilization, and it takes on a color of that civilization. But it's still pure Islam. Islam remains pure, but it takes on the culture, the deep resonances it has with that culture. So when you see Islam in Malaysia, in Morocco, in India, they're all different when you look at it. Zahiran, it looks different, doesn't it? But at the core, it's all the same. They pray the same, they do the same actions, everything's the same. But there's a distinctness about it that you know that this is an Indian type of Islam. This is a Malaysian type of Islam. This is an Omani type of Islam. This is Indonesian type of Islam. So what Islam does when it reaches these lands, it enriches those lands, just like water does. Water gives life. Right? It gives life to those cultures. It doesn't decimate those cultures. We don't bring tornadoes. We don't bring waves to those lands, if you know what I mean, from a metaphorical sense. What we do is we enrich those lands. And there's so much to be said about how Islam reached these lands and Islam spread in these lands throughout these lands without warfare. Islam is often portrayed as a religion that was spread by the sword. That's not true. There are references I can give you, there are books I can give you to read, which fundamentally refute that. If it was spread by the sword, simple question for you is, how is it that Muslims ruled over lands where they were the minority? Early Islam, they were minorities. Muslims were minorities, and most of the people that they ruled over were non-Muslims. India, Hindustan, were most of them Muslims? No. Did they convert them? Did they force them to Islam? No. If they had that, they would have all become Muslim. No, they let them have their religion. They allowed them to practice their religion. Yesterday I was looking at some masail amongst Hanafi jurists about, if we rule over non-Muslims and they want to build churches or they want to build synagogues, what's the ruling, this, that. The Hanafis talk about all of these things. But the idea was they were allowed to practice their religion. Yes, they weren't allowed to bring into the public area. You privately go to the church, you drink. If you're going to drink alcohol, you drink privately, but don't drink in the public area. So Muslims developed sophisticated ways of living with the other, with non-Muslims. But they never forced them to become Muslims. Right? If that was the case, then most of these lands would have become Muslim instantly. But we know from the statistics, from the figures, this was not the case. These people became Muslim over time. They embraced Islam because they met Muslims and they saw the akhlaq of the Muslims. They saw the superior akhlaq, the values, the moral, the ethics of Muslims, and they wanted to be a part of that system. So this is the way of Islam. So Sharia refers to the laws. It also refers to the internal state as well. So the Sharia has two aspects. One is the outward aspect, which is praying salah, being a good person, giving zakat, going for hajj. But it also has an internal aspect, which is the tariqah. The tariqah is the internal aspect. They're not at loggerheads with each other. They both work complementary. So at the same time, you're supposed to outwardly practice your religion. Inwardly, you're meant to be connected to your Creator. And tariqah means the way. Tariqah. We say tariqah, right? Haji tariq, we say this in Makkah, right? It means tariqah means the way. The tariqah means the way. It's contrasted with the Sharia, but it's not competitive with the Sharia. Remember this. There's a difference. It's contrasted with the Sharia because the Sharia is the way to a paradise, and tariqah, some people say, is the way to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you have these stories of Sufyani ulama who would they only want to be with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's for them is the ultimate success, which is to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَأَنَّ إِلَىٰ رَبِّكَ الْمُنْتَهَى. All they want is to be in divine proximity, to be close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For them, Jannah and Jahannam is obviously part of the equation, but they aspire for something higher, which is to be with your source, your creator, your master, your sustainer, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when a person becomes, if I may use the word, intoxicated in the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, all they want is to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're not interested in what everybody else thinks and what everybody else wants. They just want to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One of the ways that we can do this, our teachers would say, is to wake up for tahajjud. When everybody else is sleeping, nobody's around, you are with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. Only with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is important. Tariqah is usually used interchangeably with the word tasawwuf. In Arab culture, we usually use the word tasawwuf. Tasawwuf has many meanings. One of them is what the Sufi and Kiram used to wear, woolen clothing, suf. So they used to wear like woolen clothing, humble clothing. They used to identify themselves with tasawwuf. Some people say it comes from the word of ashab sufa, the people who used to sleep at the back of the house of the masjid of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the poor companions. So there's the idea of poverty, there's this idea of seeking knowledge through poverty and not being interested in the world. This was their nature as well. So you have this thing. And Muhammad Zakaria Kandilwi rahmatullahi alayhi has a book, we talked about this last time. One of them, which is worth reading in Urdu, is called Shari'at or Tariqat Katalazum. Shari'at or Tariqat Katalazum, how to have both together. I think this has been translated as well. And there's another one by Maulana Muhammad Deen called Shari'at or Tariqat. So our ulama have written about these things because there was obviously in that time, by some people they saw a contradiction that you can only become a scholar, not a Sufi, or you become a Sufi, not a scholar. But our ulama foregrounded, they said you have to be both. You have to be a scholar of the highest caliber. You have to produce work, lectures, books, articles, whatever, journals. But at the same time, you have to be someone who is connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is something that's happened. And in India, as you know, there was colonialism in the mix. We're talking about 1800s, 1700s. The British came, British imperialism, the British Raj. Lots has been written on this as well. And the ulama had to deal with that on one side, but they also had to deal with what they felt were certain things which were shown as bid'ah, innovations in a religion which were not part of the religion. This created a very interesting mix of conversations that took place in the context of colonial India. I prefer, by the way, using the word Hindustan. Maybe someday I'll tell you why. There's a historical reason, because Hindustan is the word that they use for themselves. India was something that the British brought upon us to make us forget about our past. So even when you change the words, India is a modern word. India, when you read the books of 1800s, 1700s, they don't say India. They say Hindustan. They say Hind. It was known as Hind. And there was a reason why they got rid of that word, so we could forget about our past, our glorious past. So even changing names are very, very important. So to know Deobandis, one has to know Deoband Madrasa. What is Deoband? Where is Deoband? It's a mid-sized town. Anyone been there here? None of you have been to Deoband? Okay, I've been to Deoband. When Shaykh Yunus, may Allah preserve him, and may Allah grant him Jannatul Firdaus, when he passed away, our teacher Mufti Abdul Samad Sahib was very close to him. So we went afterwards, after he passed away, a group of us went to Deoband and these sort of places. So Deoband is a mid-sized town. It's located about 80 miles north of Delhi. Delhi is the center over there. It's a very old town, and it's interesting, its name. One source, and listen to this. One says that the word Deoband comes from two words, a combination of two words. One word is Devi, which is actually a word for Hindu goddess, believe it or not. And then you have Ban, which means jungle. And over time it changed to Devi Band, and then obviously people used it so much it became Deoband, or pronounced as Devband. So it actually has this historical roots because of it was ruled by non-Muslims before the Muslims came there as well. It lies in a lovely place called Saharanpur. The district is called Saharanpur, and it's also part of a region called Doaba or Doaba, which is a Persian word. Do obviously means two, Aba means water or rivers. And the name is generally given to land between two rivers. So it's kind of like where two big rivers actually join. And the rivers are called the Yamuna and the Ganges River, which you must have seen on pictures or images as well. And it's a northwestern part of present-day Uttar Pradesh, UP, which is in northern India. So worth looking at the map to see where it is. So it has a place called Saharanpur, Muzaffarnagar, Meerut and Delhi. And Saharanpur lies north of it. There's a lot more that I can say about the geography and the typology of the place, or topography rather. Topography is the right word, about the land and so forth, but we're not going to go into all of that because we're not doing a geography lesson. The Maulana geography lesson right? So we're going to leave that for now as well. But geography is very, very important. On the 15th of Muharram, which is similar to actually, 1283 Hijri, which is about 30th May 1866, a madrasa was set up at Deoband, and later on it became known as Darul Ulum Deoband. So it was established in 1866. That's when it was established. 6 months later, Mazahir Ulum who we talked about a little bit last week, Shaykh Zakaria Rahmatullahi alayh, was important in that conversation. That was set up in Saharanpur. And so they were the first ones to be set up, and it's probably really influential till this day as well. For us, I think in Britain, Saharanpur is more influential because we have a stronger link thanks to people like Hazrat Shaykh, thanks to people like Maulana Yusuf Motala and their sacrifices. So we are more connected to Saharanpur than I would say to Deoband in many ways. And they still boast many scholars, much scholarship is still produced from these areas as well. The main founder was someone called Maulana Muhammad Qasim Nanotwi Rahmatullah, who died in 1880, but there were other founders as well. Maulana Zulfiqar Ali, Maulana Rafi'uddin, Maulana Fazur Rahman Usmani, Haji Muhammad Abid, Maulana Muhammad Yaqub Nanotwi. And the interesting thing about them, when you look at their biographies, is when they set up Deoband, they were fairly young. In fact, some people say they were in their 30s, very young. Can you imagine, at a young age, they were setting up what would turn out to be one of the largest revival movements in the subcontinent. So I'm saying this because sometimes we think that we have to wait till we're 40 or 50 to do important work. But if you look at some of the great scholars, warriors, leaders, they were very young when they achieved things, because from a very young age, their parents, their grandparents were doing their tarbiyah. We talked about Hazrat Shaykh last week, about how his family was a scholarly family. From a young age, he was growing up, where there would be times where he hadn't left the madrasa for such a long period. The idea was that we have to give tarbiyah to our children. We have to create that mindset of leadership, that mindset of scholarship from a young age. Unfortunately, we leave our children with like 18, 19, 21, and then we start forcing them to learn about Islam. No, from a young age, we bring in that mahol of scholarship. We create mahol at home where our children are becoming scholars, and they have high aspirations. They have ulu himma, that they want to set up something big for the future. We need to create those sort of cultures in our communities where we create people who can do this as well. Maulana Muhammad Qasim Nanotwi was really a visionary. When you read his biography and you read about him, you can get a strong sense that he was a much of a visionary. He never had like an intention to set up one madrasa. You know, like we have like one masjid we want to set up. He was like, I'm going to set up one madrasa, and we're going to set up some more after that. It became a franchise, if I can use that word. Forgive me for using that word. It's a very secular capitalist term, but we'll use the word. Right? So as soon as that madrasa was set up, he envisioned straight away that we're going to set up more of these. So he already had the vision when he set up Deoband, that I'm going to set up madaris everywhere. And because he had that vision, and because he had the sincerity in his heart, Allah Ta'ala made it so that within a few decades, hundreds of madaris were dotted all over the subcontinent as well. And they were catering for the educational needs of Muslims in India. There's a lot to be said, but traditionally the government and people would look after the ulama. The ulama would go to madrasas, and the best minds, the best of our community will go to madrasas. People would want to go there. It's like the Oxbridge of our days. Everybody wanted to send their children to madrasas, and if you got into a madrasa, you were sorted for the rest of your life. You would get a good job, you were well taken care of, you would work for the government, which is the Mughal Empire. You know, they wanted the best minds. Just like in the Ottoman Empire, the best minds would go to the madrasas. Unlike today, you know, unfortunately, we send our sort of child who's maybe not doing so well, we put him in the madrasa, hope for the best. In those days, the best minds would go to the madrasa because they valued scholarship, they valued learning. They wanted to produce the best people, because if you produce the best leaders in all fields, in science, mathematics, religious sciences, hadith, Quran, then what happens is, and this is the psychology behind it, and Shah Walillah talks about this, when you see these people, then people see them and they want to aspire to become like them. So it's like a motivational thing, it's an aspirational thing, that I want to become like him, I want to become like a scholar like him. If you want to become like him, you've got to work hard at madrasa, you've got to work hard at school, you've got to get the best grades. It's like how we do it, it's inverse today, because we want everyone to become really well in secular education, because we see the fa'idah, we see the immediate gains in that. I would argue that there isn't a takrar between them. It's not either or. We should aspire for our children to have best of both. They should be great intellectuals, thinkers, scholars, but they should also be great ulama. This is what we need. People who know the real world, people who understand the real world, but they also understand the Quran, they understand the Sunnah, they understand Hadith, they understand all these things at a very deep level as well. So this is why he didn't stop at Deoband. Maulana Qasim Nanotwi didn't stop at Deoband. Within a few months, he was already laying the foundations for madrasas in Sahrampur, Moradabad, Amroha and Delhi and other cities and towns. So immediately he was like, we're going to replicate this. Because what happened was, when the British came, they decimated the madrasas. They took away their funding sources, because we had funding sources, what we call awqaf. Rich people would give money for land or buildings, and people that would fund the madrasa. Unfortunately, madrasas now have to do chanda. You know how they come to your madrasa and they stand up, and that wouldn't happen, because people valued education. People wanted to just fund the entire madrasa. People wanted to just give land away and say, this is for my sadaqah jariyah. That's what would happen, and this is something that we need to revive today. Right? So people would do this. The British in other parts of the world and other European powers, what they did was they got rid of all these structures, and they saw that the madrasas weren't really that valuable to most of them. They're like, what's this? It's got nothing to do with what we want to achieve, because we want to do statecraft. We want to make money. Madrasas are not about making money. Madrasas are about creating insani kamil. It's about creating good people. It's about creating moral people. But they never saw any value in that. So madrasas were replaced. The qazi, who used to be like the judge, Muslim judge, they would replace them. They would get rid of them. And so like these ulama, where ulama could get good jobs, where ulama could aspire towards, this was all now being replaced with modern forms of education. So there was an upending, there was a changing of the way education was seen, and also financial structures were changed as well. Right? That they weren't funding these things anymore, because the government, the hukumat, would take care of the madrasas. But now there is no hukumat. They've been replaced by the empire. So who's going to take care of them? So huge shifts took place in the Muslim world at a great level. And we're still feeling the repercussions, the vibrations, the challenges of that still today, of what happened 150 years ago in our lands. So the ulama of Deoband and other ulama in other traditions, they realized that the only way we are going to save our religion, because we have no state support. The state is no longer interested in supporting us because they're no longer Muslim. We have to establish our own madrasas. We have to roll our sleeves up and do the work ourselves. So then the founders, they started doing local initiatives. They were getting money from the local people. And all they were trying to do, Allah bless every single one of them, was to preserve Sunnism in a climate where Islam was no longer powerful, where Islam was no longer the imperial force that it once was. And because of them, because of these ulama, because of the sacrifices they made at Darul Uloom Deoband and all the satellite madrasas that are all over the world now, we are here today. We have faith today. We have iman today. So we are indebted to these people, and they will get a reward until the day of Qiyamah for all the sacrifices they made. I'm sure, if you turned around and met Maulana Qasim Nanotwi Rahmatullah, and you said to him that, maybe I'm wrong, and you said to him that, Maulana, in 2023 there'll be 2,000 masjids in modern Britain. He would be like, what? There wasn't even a single madrasa, probably masjid in UK, then in Britain, then maybe one, right? He would be like, what are you talking about? There'll be Darul Ulooms, there'll be ulama, they will be like, nah, that's not possible. But in 2023, that's perfectly possible. Maybe knowing him for what I've read, he would say, yeah, it's possible. Because he had that vision. They were visionaries. So what I'm saying is we have to be visionaries, just like Maulana Qasim Nanotwi. If we want to claim that identity, that label of being Deoband, then we have to claim the vision of Maulana Qasim Nanotwi Rahmatullah alayh, who was like, we want to establish madaris everywhere. We want to spread our faith everywhere as well. And so he made sure that this was something to be proud of as well. Many people were affiliated as well. Now, the word Deoband or Deobandi wasn't something the ulama affiliated themselves with. It wasn't like a name that they gave to themselves. They just saw themselves as Muslims, as scholars, as ulama. Later on, people began to identify them as Deobandis. These things happen. You get labels afterwards. Right? It's post-event. So afterwards, people began to call them Deobandi, but they were mostly seen as part of Sunni orthodoxy. They were part of Sunnism. This happens with every movement. Later on, you start getting titles, you start getting labels. People start labeling you because we're obsessed with labeling people, right? So as soon as you see me, or I see you, or you see somebody else, what kind of Maulana is this? Right? We all do it. We're kind of like, Maulana ke was, where did he study? We meet people, what kind of Muslim is this? We do it all the time, don't we? We all label people in our minds. We put them in a little box. Am I right? Yes. We're obsessed with it, right? Somebody will come to somebody else. I've heard people say about me, Maulana ke was, he dresses a bit differently. He talks a bit differently. He's like this, but he's not traditional like other imams. So what kind of boxes? Like, people are obsessed with putting into boxes, right? And sometimes we also perform to fit into those boxes as well because we don't want to be ostracized. Sahih? Right? We do it, don't we? Because if I wear a slightly different topi, then that means I might not have the musalla anymore. Or if I dress a bit differently, people will see me different. We all do this. We all do it all the time. We're obsessed with identity. We're identitarians. We do this all the time. This is a modern way of thinking, by the way. This is a modern way of thinking. Modern people think like this. We put people into boxes because when the Europeans came to our lands, this is what they did. They're called anthropologists. So what they would do is they would come to all these lands. Let me tell you some history about anthropology. Anthropology is the study of human beings and civilizations. So they would go to all these islands and they would observe the people. They were innocent people. They'd come and say, oh, I'm doing a project at university and I've got a PhD in this and I want to observe this island. It could be anywhere in Australia or somewhere in New Zealand. They would observe these people, their behavior, their quirky behaviors, and they write about them and they do this. And then they go back. What would happen? They'd go back and they write a book, and that book would be an innocent book, but then it would go into the hands of the empire, the British Empire. And they'd be like, oh, this is an interesting book. I wonder what we can do with this. And you know what's going to happen now? What can we take from these people? Can you see? So what starts off an innocent adventure, you go, oh, welcome, come, study our culture. Then 10 years later, they come and take your land. You'll find this in Indonesia, you'll find this in Malaysia, you'll find this in lots of lands. This is what they did. This set the framework. The same thing would happen in India. They'd come to India, innocent Hindustan, write about Indian culture, and eventually they know how to take us over. Because once you learn about their culture and their behavior and their habits, you're ready to take them over as well. So anyway, we digress, but I don't want to go too much into that. But that's also something to be aware of, how they learn about us. So the Deoband is really seen as a maslak, a path, rather than, it's not a school of law, right? Because we all follow the Hanafi school of law, which predates by many centuries Deoband. So we are all, we follow the idea of Deoband, the maslak, the way of the Akabir, of the Deoband maslak. But in terms of our madhab, we follow Imam Abu Hanifa and his school. In terms of kalam, in our theological schools, we follow the Maturidi and Ash'ari schools as well. So this is something I wanted to say. I'm going to end because it's getting a little bit long as well. But I just wanted to give an introduction to the Deobandi framework. Maybe next week or the week after or some other point, I'll give you more insights into this. Because a lot of people come to me and say, we should get rid of all of this stuff. You know, Deobandism and thisism and thatism. I believe that you can't do that. It sounds very nice that you get rid of all of this and we should just go back to the Sahaba. And we should just go back to the early Muslims. And we should just go, everybody's saying the same thing. The Deobandis will say that, everybody's saying that. It's inherently part of our history. When something is part of your history, it's part of your culture, if you remove it, you lose your identity, you lose your sense of self-worth. What we need to do is read about our elders, read about our past, not to romanticize about it and wish that it would come back, but rather, what can we learn from them? What inspiration can we derive from these people? We need to first and foremost know who they were, because that's the first thing. People don't know even who they are. People don't know about their sacrifices. That's why I talked about as a Shaykh last time, because people don't know who these people are and the contributions that they made, and that we should be proud of our history. This is why I read Islamic history. I read Islamic history because I'm proud of what Muslims did in the past. I'm proud of what Islamic civilization has achieved when they were in power or when they were not in power, whatever. So we need to be proud of our history. We need to know our history. We need to know who we're about, where we come from, and where we're going. This is very, very important. So Allah says in the Quran, فَأَيْنَ تَذْهَبُونَ. Where are you going? And how do you know where you're going? Well, you need to know where you're from. If you look at a map, you want to go somewhere, the first thing the map's going to ask you is, where are you right now? Where are you right now? Sabse pehle to wahi, you can't, the map needs to know where are you right now. Then you can say, I want to go here. The same thing here. Where are you right now? Where are we right now as Muslims living in Britain in the 21st century? And where do we want to go? But we can do that by looking at the past and deriving benefit from that. So this was just a brief introduction. Inshallah, I'll talk a little bit more maybe next week about Maulana Qari Tayyib Sahib Rahmatullahi Ali, Maulana Rashid Ahmad Gangohi. These are important people that many of us youngsters, elders even don't know about. They claim they're Deobandi, but what does it mean to be a Deobandi? What does it mean to follow the school or the ideas of this important historical moment? May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us all tawfiq, inshallah. Subhanallah bihamdihi, subhanakallahumma bihamdika, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk.